everybody.
Yeah.
Welcome to the Ritter Dressage Show. I know, it sounds really funny. And so we're joined today by Jec Ballou. Let's see, I actually even prepared a little bio for you. Yeah. So Jec is the author of several books designed to give riders simple, straightforward tools to help their horses to use their bodies optimally. Jec's most recent published book is on a topic that many authors or trainers fail to explore, but I know it is of particular interest to many of you here watching today. It is a 4-week conditioning plan for Stifle Function and Stability is what it's called. So I've invited Jec today to talk with us and all of you about what we as riders can do to strengthen and stabilize our horses' stifles. Let's dive in. Welcome, Jec.
Well, welcome. So you
Hi.
came right.
Hi. It's a real honor. It's an honor to join you. So
as I was saying in the chat while people were arriving, I was saying we're really kindred spirits. We're really guided by the same driving passion. And so, yeah, it's so great to finally get to do this. I actually have a question. I wanted to dive right in. I have a question. I wanted to know a little bit about the backstory. What prompted you to write this book? And you have other books too, but what prompted you to write this book?
Yeah, I think it is just the result of so frequently encountering. So here's the thing. I feel like our diagnostics have gotten a lot better. I mean, one would hope, right?
Right.
The downside of that now is that, like, the unfortunate side of that is that now people can sit around and worry that their horse isn't moving right, and then they can get the vet out and validate, like, yeah, your horse isn't moving right, which is not always a reason to panic. In fact, it's not a reason to panic, but people panic and they're like, oh my God, the vet said my horse has weak stifles, or he has a locking patella or whatever. And they go in lockdown mode. They are like, yes, I'm going to stop working my horse. I don't want to make him worse. And so I was just encountering that a lot. And I was like, hang on, if you help the horse, everything's better. It's a simple process, but you got to show up and do the work. And so I just kind of wrote it down. And I've had great feedback over the past few years from people on how it works and how to modify it for different populations, younger, older horses, etc. So I just want to share it with people. So don't panic if your horse has a stifle anomaly. Like, there's a lot you can do.
It's actually really common.
Yeah.
Isn't it? I find it's really common.
Well, I was curious what you guys find, because I know I have one of Thomas's books, and I love a lot of the routines in there. And obviously they are geared towards making neuromuscular adaptation so the horse can move better. I mean, you're not calling it out as being stifle conditioning, but in some ways it is. But is this just something that you all encounter, not just in performance horses, but even recreational horses? Are you hearing this?
Yeah, we hear it a lot from our people.
In our courses, we have a lot of people who report that they have horses with stifle issues, and they always want to know, what can we do, So yeah, our own horses.
We have one. We have one that he's had stifle issues since we got him as a young horse. But we've been in barns. We were in a barn in the US, in a Morgan barn, and it was really common in that barn. So I'm sure it has a genetic component too, right?
In some bloodlines in the Morgans, you see it more often. And those trainers, they had a really nice stallion, champion stallion, with a difficult stifle, and they drove him at the walk with a heavy drag. That was their therapy, and they kept him sound that way. So that was really interesting. Basically slow.
Yeah, that's actually a great exercise, like pulling a tire or a heavy drag. Obviously it's not for every horse, but it is an exercise. I didn't include that one in my program, but it is one maybe for your listeners to explore a little bit. It's a great low impact, because there's no weight on the horse's back and you're moving at a slow speed, as you just pointed out, Thomas. So it's fun to play around with if you can.
dive in? I'm
Yeah.
trying to work on a technical issue
Yeah.
here. This is my coaster. That's
Yeah.
not the mouse.
Let me just say that I'm relieved you guys are handling the technology. Let me just go on record for saying that because, oh my gosh.
Oh my gosh. I'm so not good at
Anything
tech.
more than clicking the join button is beyond me.
Yeah, it's always an adventure.
Yeah, I'm trying
You never
to
know.
figure out why they changed the Restream Studio. I can't get to it.
No.
I can't get to it.
See that? Yeah, this restream thing is always giving us trouble. It's different every
Yeah.
time
Well,
we do it.
it's
But,
not letting me.
yeah.
Anyway, it's just a technical thing.
Mhm.
I'll continue to try to
Yeah.
access so I wanted to see what questions and
Mhm.
comments we have on YouTube and
Yeah.
Facebook, but you can continue.
Yeah, just, I think the first time I encountered a horse that had a stifle issue was a little over 20 years ago, actually. And there was a warm blood who didn't want to go forward. And, if you if you try to send him forward, how you normally do it, he get defensive and belligerent, actually. And it seemed like he would escalate if you kept pushing, and I thought that was very odd. And I asked the owner to maybe have a vet out and check the horse out, see what's going on. And then turned out, there was something going on with the stifle. And sort of that stuck in my memory that horses with stifle problems may get behind the aids. They may not want to push, like the stifle discomfort or pain seems to impact the ability to push and with the hind leg. So that's why it made sense when Morgan trainers had the horse pull that drag, because essentially it's a slow pushing action. So you can strengthen the joint and the muscles around it by working on, pushing, but not right forward in the working trot, but, people generally.
The propulsion.
Yeah. So I thought that was interesting.
And I was happy to see that the title of this chat was Stifle Stability and Strength. I was really happy to see that because I think sometimes people get lost with their horse because they're given the instruction to go strengthen the stifle, like go build strength. And so they start going up and down hills or whatever. But really, until the stifle is in a stable place, you're not going to add the strength you want necessarily. And so the plan that I drew up that is on my website right now, a lot of it is derived from the American Association of Equine Practitioners, which puts out a lot of research and new info each year. And so you start with actually stationary exercises, and that's the stability. That's the firing up of the stabilizing muscles that you need first in order to then go at strength. And sometimes people, I understand there's so much to learn and find out. Sometimes people get lost in that process and they don't see any progress and they're like, I'm giving up. My horse has weak stifles. Or they get frustrated, like what you described, Thomas. Like I see that with a lot of people trying to pick up the canter. Like the horse will kick out or just doesn't want to canter one way or the other. And commonly, not always, but commonly the stifle thing. And the rider can just get really confused about how to resolve that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I took a look at your book, and I thought it was very interesting that you do a lot of these picking up the front leg or the hind leg, shoulder rotations, and that was interesting. So that has to do with the stability, and the tail
like
pulls and things. I thought was interesting.
Yeah, those stabilizing exercises, like increasingly we find out how valuable they are for the overall picture. And I have to quickly caution people, like you can't get away with doing only those, but those are so beneficial to then layer strength on top of. And, I'm an avid athlete myself. And I see when I lean into those kind of stabilizing exercises, man, I see and feel the difference. And they're almost so simple. You're like, well, this is dumb, but they actually work.
That's so interesting. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So is it something you would recommend for basically every horse, or just for specific problems like stifles?
So depending on the horse's response, I do suggest at least a couple of the exercises for every horse. So what I like to do is try out the various exercises in there. So in that plan, there's like the pelvic matrix, which encompasses some of these stationary stabilizing exercises, the tail pull, the resistance in the pelvis, the three-legged stance, which is just simply holding your horse's hoof up for a minute at a time to test core stability. If I have a horse that really responds to one of those in a good way, like my own horse really responds to the tail traction, like especially a little bit of the sideways tail traction, I just notice, I feel and I see changes in him. So that's one I always do with him, even though I wouldn't classify him as having weak stifles necessarily, but just based on his response to them. I'm a huge advocate though of people using corrective exercises to supplement what they're doing. I think you tune into the horse better. And I also just think most of our domesticated horses live pretty sedentary lives. Even if you ride for an hour a day, that's not much. Horses in nature move a lot more than that. So the more we can give their bodies, better, I think.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But don't despair. If you're a listener and you only ride 30 minutes a day, that's awesome. Like, I'm not disparaging small amounts of exercise. It's the consistency that counts. It's just the horses are capable of way more than we sometimes credit them with.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
So we have some questions. Lydia, Frost had asked, are there exercises for all horses or just horses with weak stifles? You basically answered that already, right?
Okay.
So that then Kath says, Kath Thomas, what are the symptoms to look out for, I guess, for weak stifles?
Okay, so weak stifles, and so we'll delineate that from like unstable stifles, which would be, or painful stifles, so that would be a different condition. And it's funny because we always say weak stifles, but stifle is the joint, right? And when we talk about weakness, we're really talking about the muscles that support that joint. So things to watch out for are, we've already mentioned a couple, but a reluctance to move forward can be a sign. Kicking out, or especially cross cantering. If you are routinely trying to get your young horse to canter on a 20-meter circle and you're kind of consistently getting a cross canter in one direction, that's almost always a weakness in the muscles that support a stifle. Walking downhill, if they're struggling a bit with that and kind of wanting to shift their hips all around, or just charge down the hill instead of being a nice balance, that is generally an indication of weak stifles. And then obviously resistance to collection can be weak stifles. That can also be a lot of other things, but these muscles are all interconnected through the hindquarter fascia. So when you diagnose what might be a weak stifle, chances are good you're including other tissues that are good to work on anyway. So generally the recommendation is get off the circle, stop circling. And interestingly, stop riding a lot of transitions. If the horse is like noticeably weak, not if you're just like, I wonder if my horse is weak, but if the horse is definitely weak, maybe your vet has even said, you need to strengthen these stifles. You want to stop doing a lot of transitions between gaits, because that can actually get the inflammation too much, to the point where the horse has these pain signals that are blocking its stability in the stifle. So you want to do a lot of straight line work. You want to do a lot of just brisk trotting, just rhythmic trotting, a repetitive sort of movement, and then some work in slightly deeper sand. So I'm not on the metric system, sorry, but like 3 inches or so of sand, or a surface. You might have wood chips or something, but a surface they have to sort of really propel themselves through. Yeah. And then gentle hills. So sometimes, everybody knows when we got to go ride hills and they go climb the steepest thing they can find. That's actually counterproductive. It's like if you're going to start a weight routine and you start with a 200-pound deadlift, right? That you're not going to make the adaptations you want. So it's actually better, even if you have like a 4% grade, which is like just a real gentle slope. There's a whole variety of extra ways to use that hill beyond just going up and down it. You can change your speed going up and down. You can circle across the slant. I think there's even a clever German word for that.
Yeah, those are great ideas.
Yeah.
So how do you handle lateral movements and with stifle issues?
Yeah, so lateral movements so again, it depends on the horse's level of training. So like in a situation with a horse who's had some schooling, or maybe they're more mature and they use their body pretty well anyway, they're pretty balanced, then lateral work can really help strengthen the stifle. However, lateral work can be contraindicated if the horse is not very well schooled, meaning it doesn't have just a good balance in its walk, trot, canter gaits, or it's kind of a high anxiety horse. Because I have to remind people the stifle joint is a flexion extension joint. It's not a lateral moving joint. So when we do lateral movement, that action of the hind leg comes more from the hip, and the muscles surrounding the hip is where the leg swings laterally from. So that's why I say if the horse is like really green and somebody read an article that said, oh, Dr. Ritter recommended I do shoulder in, and they start doing a bad semblance of shoulder in, it just creates strain on the stifle actually, and it can set you back. But let's say it's a rehab situation where that horse has been trained to a high level of dressage. He already knows the lateral movements, like they're already in his body, right? In that situation, you could, when you're bringing that horse back into work, they could be more part of the program. Because you're not going to encounter the same like lack of balance and strain and bracing, which is none of which we want.
Vets are often or seem to be afraid of lateral movements when horses were injured and they're being rehabbed. They often recommend just go straight, no circles, no lateral work. But
it's not just what you do; it's also how you do it.
How you do it, and
that's the thing. Yeah,
vets probably see a lot of the outcomes of poorly done lateral work. And I think a lot of people have a little bit that competitive mindset of we ride an entire long side and it's got to be 3 tracks or it's got to be 4 tracks, and then they might do it badly or the horse might not be ready for it. But like I myself like to use these homeopathic doses of lateral movements with just a tiny amount, where it's like you feel it more than you see it, so you feel that movement go through the body, and maybe not a whole long side, but maybe just a few steps, and then maybe do a volte or something else, right? So that it doesn't last all that long, and it's not intense in that sense, not extreme, right? And in those small doses, I find it very beneficial, and helps with balance and straightness and suppleness and so on.
Yeah, so 2 things. One, I'm super glad that you use the word dose and dosage, because I think that's huge. I mean, a lot of people know what might be good exercises, but it comes down to dosage, right? And either doing something enough to get the value or not overdoing it. And that's part of why I wrote down my plan as well. It's just people just like to be told what to do on some level, they don't want to have to do all that thinking themselves. But the second point, Thomas, is I'm laughing because I think I agree wholeheartedly with what you said. And I think sometimes this is a rider thing too, right? Like they might only intend to do 4 strides of shoulder in, but it might take them closer to like 40 or 50. I mean, I've been there myself, right? Like I'm visualizing myself looking just like Dr. Ritter. And really, I've just spent the last 40 strides, right? Trying to get, and in my head, I'm like, yeah, that was about 4 strides. And really, so yeah, I agree with what you're saying. There's an artistry to it.
Yeah, it's interesting. Also another thing, just slight detour. When we talk about stifle issues, I think we probably often use the term a little in a fuzzy way, but what types of stifle injuries or problems are there? Because it's not just
because we were talking about weak stifles, but there's also unstable stifles and painful stifles we were talking about.
And the loose ligaments and the patella issues.
That would be unstable, I think.
Yeah. So
Jec, so I'm seeing a lot. I don't know if it's because of the breeding has changed or what, but I'm seeing a lot of or I'm hearing a lot about locking patellas.
Yeah.
And that's something that I never worried too much about, because typically it is a developmental thing. I mean, typically you see it in young horses. It can be very alarming. I mean, it can look like, oh my God, my horse broke his leg. Like, what is going on? Once you figure out what it is and you've seen it in a couple of horses, they almost 100% of the time it resolves with fitness. But interestingly, in the last year, I've heard from so many people who have a horse who's in that 3 to 5 year old range, and this locking stifle presents itself. Then they panic and they put the horse on stall rest, which is like the worst thing that you can do, right? Is rest the horse. And so that's a case of I don't know if that's necessarily instability, but I would put it in that column. It's a little bit dysfunctional. So if any of the listeners are listening, the first thing that you want to do, like if the horse is actively, sometimes if the limb is so locked that they cannot take a step forward, you go out in the pasture and they can't move, just back them up 4 steps and it'll release the ligament, and then you can walk them into the barn. But it all, like I say, it almost always goes away with fitness. But sometimes, so you mentioned pain. This is such an interesting one because sometimes, and hoof balance is so tied in with this. So sometimes you get inflammation, especially for horses long toes. You know, you get inflammation, which a lot of times you can feel, but be careful because your horse can be reactive down there. So don't go squeezing the stifle too much. But a lot of times you can feel heat or inflammation or like sponginess in the stifle, which is not a great sign. And those pain signals, a lot of times they can be referred from the lower back, right? Because those nerves, nerves that come down off pelvis into the quadriceps through the low back. So when there's tension in a low back, so think about horses with ulcers or saddle fit, or just like I said, high anxiety horses, that might be showing up in the stifles. You might have major stability problems. Like the horse might have that feeling where you're riding him and his hind leg like kind of buckles. You know, you have a step where you're like, oh my God, he just dropped out behind. A lot of times that's coming from, it's originating in the low back, but showing up in the stifles. And if you do these stifle exercises, it can totally help resolve. You know, everything sort of talks to each other. It can help. It is something you sort of have to be mindful of. So I was curious, do you guys see that a lot? I see it a lot where like horses like kind of lose their hind limb, you know, they kind of like buckle behind.
We see that occasionally.
That's the horse that I have that has stifle issues. That's what he does. He just like all of a sudden the hind leg is gone for a stride, and it scares him. He's a very sensitive horse, so when that happens, he gets scared, you know, because balance is an important prerequisite for feeling safe. You know, they're prey animals, and so if they feel out of balance, this is an unsafe situation for them. So he gets frightened when that happens. He's now older and he deals with it, but it still happens occasionally, even though he's in condition, you know. But they see we have a lot of people in the chat actually commenting, so we could read some of those. We did have a question too, which is related to, you were just starting to mention the feet, how important the hoof balance is. And Heather McCann asked, is there any advantage to putting shoes on the hind end to help with weak stifles? And I don't know how to answer that question myself. I tend to. I mean,
I'm guessing, is she talking about corrective shoeing, maybe?
Or to give the better support for the hoof is what I'm assuming. That's the rationale, I think. I personally tend to keep my horses barefoot as much as possible.
I was going to say, I'm such a barefoot fan. I mean, not all my horses are barefoot. They can't all be, but in my perfect world, they would all be. That said, maybe this person might have a horse like a real flat-soled thoroughbred or something that has hoof pain. Like real flat soles, or maybe a heel that doesn't grow well. So if there's potentially pain associated with the foot, it can help to put a shoe on for sure, because those pain signals, they create instability. They create instability to such a degree that all the structures can be totally fine, but the horse will be like losing his hind leg or can't drive under themselves. And sometimes like even kind of collapsing a little bit. So I'm going to guess that's what the listener had in mind. And in that case, the shoes can be temporary. I don't generally recommend wedge pads though. So because that is going to totally change the tension on those ligaments in the stifle. And those are the ligaments we're trying to condition. So you don't want to lift the heel and bring more slack into that area. And I say this from experience, I've seen people try all kinds of things. So, you know, just take all my observations and experience to heart, because I never see it go well when they try to, you know, sort of monkey around a little bit with the feet angle, that is.
So interesting. That's so great that you brought that up.
It's very interesting. Here, Catherine Trebelli wants to know if there are some breeds that are more likely to have stifle issues than others.
I haven't looked at the current data, but I know, well, this is probably, 8 or more years old at this point, but I was talking to several sports medicine vets here in the US, and they felt that breeds that grow quicker as young horses, so they saw particularly thoroughbreds and some of the warm blood breeds, because that joint is so big. I mean, those horses mature very large as well, but they grow quite rapidly as youngsters, and the structures don't all keep up with each other. So you end up with phases where the ligaments are quite sloppy and loose and stretched out like the belts on your car. So warm bloods, thoroughbreds, with those big joints. I've certainly seen that myself in my own training, but that's a question I was interested in, if you guys have seen particular breeds with a higher prevalence of, stifle issues, whether that's weakness or locking, patellas, that sort of thing.
Yeah, well, 20 years ago, the Morgans apparently had certain bloodlines that were more prone to stifle problems. There was some Frisians, exactly. That's what I was thinking. We heard that the Frisians,
But
again,
this
probably
was,
certain bloodlines.
just what people generally told us a lot.
Yeah.
We've seen it in these breeds, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's representative of every horse on the planet.
Right.
So,
what's really interesting? I agree. What's interesting about those is Frisians and Morgans in particular is it's almost like a chicken or egg. I mean, those are naturally uphill, bigger in front kind of horses. Yeah, and driving horses, and we all know that if a horse is kind of in absolute elevation without the back being lifted, it pushes the stifle joints behind them. No matter how animated or energetic they are, they can't drive the hind legs forward. So I wonder if you bred enough of those bloodlines with that kind of training, if it sort of filtered down to have weaker stifles. I don't know. It's just a question for our audience to ponder.
Yeah, no, I agree. That's interesting.
Yeah, I was thinking too, some breeds where the horses sometimes have the hind legs conformationally out behind, like saddlebreds sometimes have that too. The Frisians have it sometimes. I wonder if that conformation type with these, maybe also where the pelvis is rotated out behind, like the Arabs sometimes, and the hind legs a little bit straight and out if they're more prone to it.
Yeah, but do you see stifle issues a lot in Arabs? The Arabs
I see a lot of Arabs.
never
I know.
issues.
They're hardy horses.
Yeah, very.
They're so tough. They are so tough. Arabians are just amazing athletes.
Can scramble up and down a hill, in and out of anything.
Yeah, it would make sense that certain conformation types would be more likely to develop those issues than others. Certain angles in the joints or certain pelvic position. And like you say, the high elevation of the neck, the high set neck, that would make sense.
Even if it's like a referred issue, the pain actually starts perhaps in the back and it gets transferred to the stifles, maybe because the body has to compensate in ways too. And so this can cause some compensation somewhere that causes the stifles to become weak or unstable. Possibly. I don't know. We're getting into the territory of, ooh, maybe this, maybe that.
Yeah, it's just cool to think about, and I love watching how the pieces go together, and we haven't yet talked about big issues like Stringhalt. Right. And that's right. It's not in the stifle necessarily, but it can act like a stifle instability. So for any of our listeners, Stringhalt is that jerky movement that horses can make with their hind leg, or sometimes it'll get just frozen in a lifted position and there could be muscle tremoring that's associated with it. It's one of those conditions that we're learning more and more about. Unfortunately, we don't know as much as I wish we did, but there is something wrong with the nerves to help resolve that function. And what's interesting is anxiety or excitement worsens the condition by far. When those horses are in a much more relaxed state, sometimes it can go away for a period of time, or seasonally it can sort of resolve and then it'll come back up owing to certain elements. But I've read some research which indicates, and this is interesting, is that a lot of the dysfunction with those kinds of conditions is more in the extensor muscle chain. And I remember, I'm just tying this into dressage, because I remember Udo Berger writing in his, one of his great pieces of writing, that he felt like a lot of horses' movement problems to move well under saddle was because of excess strength in the extensor muscle chain, not slackness, tension, tightness in the top muscles of the horse's body, the propulsion muscles. And I thought, I think there's a lot of truth to that. I certainly think when you're riding a horse that's really heavy on the bit, or pulling your armpits out, I think a lot of times that is the extensor muscle chain. What are your thoughts on that, though? I'm curious.
Yeah, absolutely. When they're heavy in the bridle, then they're pushing too much and not supporting enough. So yeah, there would be more. Exactly. The extensor muscles probably develop too much, and the flexor muscles not enough. Steinbrecht writes about that too, actually. That is the heaviness and so on is extensor muscles working too much. And of course, then the joint angles play a little bit of a role too, right? If you have a horse with very straight hind legs, they tend to push way more than they carry or support. And then if you have a horse that is, what do you call it now, Säbelbeinig, so the hock is flexed too much and the hind legs are too much underneath the body.
Not
not cow hock, the other one.
Cow hock.
What's
We
that?
call it sickle.
Sickle hock. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Sickle hock.
I have forgotten the English terms.
Yeah, in German it's saber-legged, So yeah, they the joints are so flexed and the leg is so far under the body that these horses don't push enough, and they support, but not necessarily in a healthy way, right? The hind legs can get overburdened, and then those horses can't gain any ground. And with those horses, you have to ride more forward, and with according to Steinbrecht, and I think he's right in that too, right? And the horses with the straight hind legs, or where the hind legs are naturally out behind, you always have to try and get the hind legs under the body and flex them more, so that you create a balance between extensors and flexor muscles. So I always find that interesting. So and of course, if you follow these kind of procedures right forward, then with certain conformation types can be disaster, right? So you have to do the opposite. But
to your point, it's so important for many horses for their soundness, and not to be picky with horses that have less than ideal conformation. There's plenty that do, but we really have to understand their shortcomings and also the conditioning that they need just to do the basic exercises. And to your point, sometimes the answer is just to forget about everything being perfect. You got to ride forward for a bit, for a period of time. Especially when we're talking about Stifle.
At the whole body and how all the different parts of the body work together and what the conformation is like, which sometimes means you may have to do something different from your standard riding manual that you've read or learned when you were young,
that's the hard part. Absolutely right. Sometimes it doesn't follow the progression you might want. And then when you run into something like a horse that is very weak in its stifle and it just kind of stonewalls you for a bit, or it can be frustrating if you go through periods of different conditioning throughout the year. If you live in a place that has real winter, for example, then it can be really frustrating. I see people, especially I feel like with the canter, they can get stuck developing their horse's canter because the summer months are great and they get the horse conditioned. And then as soon as that particular horse has a period of downtime, boom, that weakness is back. And I have to tell people, don't think that this is like the death sentence. Like, your horse physiologically is different. And as soon as the horse loses fitness, you're going to see this issue, but it's going to go away when you get them fit again. That's just the reality of it. And there's plenty of humans that are the same way. If they don't stay fit, things start to fall apart. Whereas then there's some people who can sit on the couch for weeks and get up and run a 10K, and you're like, come on, that's not fair. But they have different physiology.
Right. I'm so glad you said that. Yeah.
So here's an interesting question from Maria Bowman. She says, is OA, so I guess osteoarthritis in the stifles, a more serious diagnosis than other stifle issues?
Which was it? Is it?
Is OA, or I guess it's osteoarthritis in the stifles, a more serious diagnosis than other stifle issues?
It depends on the severity, really. I have known, actually, I have a couple of horses in my barn right now who have just a bit of arthritis in their stifles, and they're, one is 21 years old and one's 22. They're still performing at quite a high level. That said, I let them tell me when things are feeling, I mean, with arthritis, some days are better, some days are not. And it really depends on, it's such a broad term, arthritis. It depends on how much is there. Is it worse on one side? It's kind of a complex issue, but it doesn't, to answer the basic question, is it worse? I don't think so. I don't think arthritis is a worse condition than having like an unstable stifle, or sometimes horses will go through what seems like a neurological kind of episode, which could be maybe they ate some toxic plants, maybe they've had an illness, and they can get really wobbly behind and become unstable. Yeah. And those can be tricky situations to resolve. I would classify those as maybe being a little bit more complex than arthritis. Yes. Unless her main interest is trail riding and she has nothing but steep mountains to go up and down, that can start to be painful. But I always like to let the horse tell me. I don't like to treat horses like they're old or like they're sidelined until they really give me a reason to do so, because motion is lotion. And if you start restricting motion, they respond by having a restricted output, right?
Right. Yeah, that's very true. Yeah, with arthritis, usually movement is good.
Yeah, almost always.
Keep the horse going. Then here, Jeanette Favage says, I have a horse that just had a medial patellar fenestration for sticking stifle. Is there anything different you would recommend for a horse like this?
Not necessarily, except maybe a gentle encouragement that don't assume that because the procedure's been done that it's, you never have to think about this. Like I would still, with that particular horse, offer them at least the conditioning calisthenics on a weekly basis, 2-3 times a week, because it is only good for a horse. So sometimes, like if we get a little surgery done or a little procedure done, we think, okay, boom, check that box, I'm good to go. And you can get a couple of years down the road, and that horse's physiology is still a certain way. That being that it had some stifle dysfunction at one point, you don't want it coming back. So, these calisthenics only take a handful of minutes, and it's just something that goes a long way. It's just like with people when they do form drills or they do a little bit of Pilates or yoga for even 5 minutes a day. The way it talks to your nervous system is so important.
Or like the Feldenkrais, because we do a lot of Feldenkrais in our
courses.
And it feels cool. It's so subtle, but it has a huge effect on the body and the human. And also when we do this with the horses too, same thing, has a huge effect. So I think that this is very well matched. The work that you're describing.
Yeah.
Totally. Yes, absolutely.
So here, Susan Hinton-Smith says, very interesting to hear that Jec has seen more horses with locking stifles. I have a 6-year-old horse who was diagnosed with PSD when she was 4. The most alarming issue is that the stifles were getting worse and worse last year. She has now been turned out 24/7 for the last 10 months, and the stifle issue has virtually disappeared.
Yay. Oh, that's great. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Movement, right? More movement helps.
Yeah. Great.
That's good if you can, if you have enough space to turn the horses out 24/7. That's awesome. And then Alison Krause says, my horse occasionally has his hind leg kind of drops away. I've been told he has stiffness in his lumbar area. His barefoot trimmer has made major progress with his hooves. Sounds like the stifle exercises could be helpful.
Yeah, so it sounds like potentially they're resolving the physical issues that might be causing maybe an outward rotation or lack of strength in the stifles, and now they could be toned and strengthened.
Yeah.
And I always tell people that, like, I am a huge fan of Bodywork. I think Bodywork's terrific. But I always caution people, like if you know your horse has a particular physical situation you're working on, don't assume that body worker is going to come and resolve it. Of course, the horse is going to feel amazing for the couple of days after the body worker works on it, but then you have to do the follow-up exercises for the long-term outcome, right? So I don't know if you guys see this, but I hear a lot of people say they have to get the chiropractor out all the time because the horse's SI joint is always, going out and it needs to be adjusted. And I was like, well, hang on.
Yeah.
Sure, an adjustment is always a good idea, but why does it keep going out?
Exactly.
So I'm a big fan of Bodywork, but I am just as big a fan of getting on and riding your horse in a good manner, because that is at the end of the day what keeps their body good.
And Bodywork can't replace training, but it can support it, right? And it's like you say, after an adjustment, if you get on and ride the horse badly, then the joint goes out again right away, right? If you make them drop their
the
back,
tightness comes right back in muscles and all of these things, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, and with good training, I mean, the intervals in which you have to call the chiropractor should get longer, right? And they should hold the adjustment longer, actually, and go out less and less. Yeah.
So I did just read an interesting, while you all are managing the chat room, I'll just babble on, but I did just read some really interesting, compelling reports from vets in the last year that, at least here in California, I don't know if this is a trend where you are, but I have noticed that people are keeping their young horses fatter and fatter. And I don't know if it's a desire to sort of feed the horse until they take on this physical appearance that they're really fit. You know what I mean? Like bulk them up. I don't know what it is, but I'm seeing a lot of really overweight 2 and 3 year olds. And I just wonder if our eye has maybe shifted. So this is what we think is normal now. I don't know. But I have read some very compelling reports that the ability to make proprioceptive gains is significantly muted long-term for those horses if they are overfed and carry excess weight as a 2 and 3 year old. Even if down the road they get leaner and fitter and whatever, they are kind of missing the boat a little bit. So I'm not just on my own soapbox here. I have some compelling reports from vets saying, vets who sort of look at movement and biomechanics that so this is an interesting trend I'm seeing in California, which is shocking because hay is ridiculously expensive. So I don't know why we have any fat horses, but are you all seeing this?
Yes and no. I mean, I've heard in the past that horses that are fed a diet that's too rich when they grow up, that they're more likely to develop OCD, that sort of thing. And what we're sort of seeing, from a distance is that when people take their young horses to breed shows, there's stallions and mares and want to get them approved and this and that. They often try to make their 3-year-olds look like their 8-year-old FAI horses, basically, right? So they bulk them up and they feed them steroids or whatever. And of course, that can't be healthy, right? So people who are not competing their young horses in these breed shows, maybe they don't do that, they don't overfeed them and don't give them, all these steroids and things. But the people who want, compete and win, they probably do.
Or they're trying to sell horses because people they're more likely to buy a horse that is in, the bloom of good condition, right? With a little healthy fat and everything. But a 2 and 3 year old in most breeds, they should still be really lean, even skinny. That's what's normal. Yeah.
But it's true that customers will probably pay more money for a fat and round 3-year-old than for a skinny one, that's a little ribby, I would think,
I think you're right.
Most of the time. So,
it's interesting, very interesting. Another question here, Colleen Carr, would you describe what is an unstable stifle?
So that's a good question. So we touched on it a moment ago, but it would an example would be, probably the most common example is, let's say you're trotting along or you're going going from trot into a canter, and the horse seems to kind of like its back leg got pulled out behind them, and what you'll feel in the saddle is like they drop out from under you momentarily. Sometimes they'll do it without a rider as well. It's like the leg gets stuck in the extension phase and is slow to come forward, which is exactly what's happening. That is an example of an unstable stifle. Sometimes too, and that's just why it's good to make a habit of observing your horse's natural posture, just standing around. But sometimes you'll see unstable stifles in the case of horses that rotate outward with the stifles. So if you just visualize the stifle joint should be tracking forward, but if you notice one or both of your horses, when he's just standing around at the tie rack, if they rotate out, that can be a kind of a red flag for an unstable stifle. Sometimes we mentioned before, instability and strength sort of can overlap in the case of reluctance to go into a canter if the horse kicks out. That can be related to other things, but usually if there's a pattern there, you can narrow it down to being stifle related. That can be a stifle that's not tracking well inside the joint, and it can cause like a pinch or sting, a moment of discomfort, and the horse will kind of like kick out sideways like they're kicking at a fly, and then they'll kind of roll into the canter. It's not that they don't canter, it's like they get there, but it's like the sensation of like zing, and that's just an stifle. If you're kind of questioning whether your horse is on, how they're developing, maybe you have a young horse, you're not sure, you can always ask them to back up. If there's a lot of toe dragging and scuffing going on, the stifles could use some development. It's not a reason to panic, but that is an indication that the stifles are a little bit unstable. So those are the main things. And then if you're a trail rider, I mentioned before, coming downhill, if the horse is struggling, and let's say they're not older with arthritis, if they're struggling to come downhill, generally that's an indication that something's unstable. Either there's pain in the hock and or the stifle is unstable. So those are the main things. Guys are getting dive bombed over there.
You mentioned the rotation of the hind legs. That's an interesting thing. Sometimes you see horses where both hind legs are turned out. Sometimes it's just one. And I always wonder a little bit what that's from. And sort of a hypothesis I have is that maybe the external rotator muscles are overdeveloped, and maybe the adductors and so on are not developed enough, or something like that. What do you think?
Well, right. It makes me think that maybe the stifle issue is a symptom of something.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought that up, because I'm really glad you brought that up, because you're totally right. You can create an outward rotation in the stifle, not that we want to, but you can create that by excess tension. Right. In the muscles higher up. They can rotate the stifle out. So then it's like, well, chicken or the egg, right? Which came first? And sometimes, and again, this comes down to a horse's temperament. If they are just a really willing, giving kind of horse, they are not necessarily going to be reluctant to move forward. Whereas some might, in that same situation, you might have totally different behaviors, right? So to your point, a person who's riding their horse in balance, that's the answer, right? And you're not likely going to ever notice like, oh, my horse had problematic stifles and they started to rotate outward, because you're already keeping ahead of it by good gymnastic development, right? I mean, any horse has the ability to have weak stifles and outward rotation if they have that excess tension in, well, especially like the biceps femoris muscle or the hamstring group. We want them toned, but excess tension, and to your point, if they're totally underdeveloped in the adductors, you can create some problems that may or may vary in degrees of severity based on your horse's temperament and natural physiology, pain tolerance, that sort of thing.
Yeah, see, in the past I thought, well, it's just conformation. It's just the way the skeleton is. But more and more I'm thinking it's really more, maybe muscular development and balance and straightness and so on, and that you can actually change the conformation, so to speak. Right?
Yeah, it's so cool.
Maybe not it's the conformation, but you change the way the muscles interact with the skeleton.
Exactly. But then it makes the conformation appear different, right? You're not really changing conformation, but you make it look different because the horse is now carrying himself differently and moving differently. And I thought it's fascinating. So, possibilities.
Yeah, they can look totally differently. It's so gratifying. Their bodies are so cool. They're just so cool.
Yeah. Actually, Alison Krause says, do you see stifle issues increase with older horses?
I wouldn't say so, actually, unless in the case of arthritis, like we've talked about. The only time I see stifle issues issue being like pain or all of a sudden that instability where the horse loses its hind leg. The only time I see that getting worse with age is in horses that are ridden really hollow their whole lives. Maybe it's just a recreational rider that never had access to instruction or something. And after about age 18, all that starts to catch up with a horse. So those are the only times I'll see, all of a sudden the horse is pretty dysfunctional, like they're not tracking up very well with their back legs, for example, or they're tripping a lot, because we haven't talked a lot about pain, but a horse that is painful in a stifle, whether that started because of hoof issues, maybe abscesses and or incorrectly balanced feet or genetics. Pain in the stifles, most horses will want to push their weight forward to unburden the hind end. And then you can get things like the horse is tripping a lot and stumbling in front. You can end up with shoulder problems, sometimes a front end lameness will crop up or muscle imbalances in the shoulders. So, but as I said, after the age of about 18, similar to us, you get to a certain age and stuff just starts catching up with you if you haven't done it right? So.
I also think that if there's wear and tear, especially from incorrect riding, it'll show up in hocks and front legs first, because the stifle joints are big and there are big muscles around it, whereas the hock is more delicate and no muscle around it. And the front legs, of course, they're much more susceptible. It's the way I think you see a lot of these other joints being affected first before the stifles really suffer wear and tear, I would think.
Unless there was
no, that's a good point.
Yeah,
I totally agree with that. That's a good point.
So interesting.
Yeah. So Maria Lohman, she had asked about the osteoarthritis. She says, my horse was diagnosed with it in both stifles as an 8-year-old a year ago through nerve blocking, no x-rays. So they diagnosed it. She says, I'm now curious if you diagnose osteoarthritis without x-rays. The symptoms were not wanting to go forward, backing off, going into a jump, and basically not enjoying his work. He was injected with steroids, and the vet said that he will probably need injections a couple of times a year. I don't want to go down that road, so I'm trying to help him with strengthening work. He's been very good for the last few months and really happy in his work. He's a Connemara thoroughbred cross with good conformation. Good question.
Okay. Wow. Yeah. Well, I applaud you for not wanting to go down the road of tons of injections. So that's great to hear. And generally the recommendation would be to totally change disciplines or exercises for a while. So if it was, jumping is, in my opinion, very taxing on the horse. I'm so impressed with jumpers. I'm just totally impressed with jumpers. So if the main resistance was demonstrating there, then I definitely would avoid jumping. And perhaps the jumping days are over. They might not be, but maybe for now, for the next 6 months. And it sounds like you're on the right track. What I would definitely highlight with this course is this might sound counterintuitive, but don't get laser focused on the stifles necessarily. This is the kind of horse where I would say you want to do everything you can to take care of this horse's back. So we were talking about the interconnection of the low back and the stifles. This horse in particular, I would say, make sure that horse's back is staying really loose and supple. And so things I would recommend, and then I'll be curious what you guys would recommend. I would recommend plenty of stretching the horse out, long and low trotting. I would do forward gallops off the horse's back, just 2-point, just out in the field to get good back activity. and muscle recruitment. And then I would do the exercises that are in the Stifle plan, like tail traction, keeping the hamstrings relaxed, all of those unmounted support exercises. But your biggest key to get this horse, I think, to move forward again and to stay really functional with Stifles is to make sure the horse is swinging and correctly using his back. I would not use, definitely no restrictive agents like draw reins or side reins. Those are just going to add tension to the back, and we don't want to add tension to the back. How about you all? If this was a student, maybe this is a student of yours, I don't know. What would you recommend?
Yeah, I mean, I agree also. I mean, I'm always a little bit afraid of injecting joints because I think the danger that something goes wrong, the joint gets infected is high. And then I'd rather go about it, conservatively with gymnastics and, back activity, suppleness of the rib cage is super important. That the horses don't get stuck in the rib cage. So a lot of bending and turning and sidestepping combinations are good. And what I find really effective is if you engage one hind leg, and you can do this homeopathic sort of shoulder for a few strides, and then maybe sit on that hind leg. So you bring it under the body, you sit on it, flex it a little, and then usually the horse wants to sort of rebound, lift the back, stretch the top line. So you can go back and forth between bringing the hind leg under, flexing it, and from there let the horse stretch down. And you can do this on a circle, and then maybe little side stepping on the circle, and then ride a volley at the circle point, or stretch down. So you have this. You don't spend much time in any one posture, but you let the horse go through a range of postures and motions, and you target this hind leg, you target that hind leg, so the whole body gets worked, always back to front, and get the horse to stretch the outside, and then, change the bend and things like that. And I find that makes them very nice and supple, and then the whole body becomes connected and soft. So.
Yeah, and it's, I like I like how you describe things, first of all. And I think for listeners, it is important to know that when we study muscle function, that a muscle becomes stronger by being recruited at about 75% of its maximum force for about 10 seconds. That's kind of a magic, if you can get 10 seconds of recruitment, then you've made a gain. It's like a deposit in the bank. So if you think of terms of that, because sometimes we think these big, strong animals, these horses, surely they must need 30 minutes of me riding them on the bit at the trot, right?
30 minutes of
what you're describing, right? What you're describing with, this, you make a half volta, and then maybe you sidestep this way. And if you start thinking about that, it's probably about a little bit like 10 seconds here and 10 seconds there. And if our audience can really keep that in mind, that does have science behind it, that this is the way to get.
Yeah, that's interesting that you say that's actually been researched scientifically, because it's something for me. It's more of an experience that I've noticed at some point, and I work with it and I explore it, and it works well if you do shorter distances in one movement, and then you combine this, engaging the hind leg with loading it by turning onto a vault or sitting into it or half vaulting or doing a down transition, and then allowing the horse to rebound or come up out of that squat. Basically, asking the horse to sit behind is like going down into a squat, but then you don't want to stay there forever, right? Otherwise, your legs fall off, and then you have to extend the joints and then use that rebound energy to get the horse to lift the back and the withers and stretch the top line. And my Lusitano, he always asks for it. Actually, if when I engage and sit, and he always asks, could I now, stretch a little bit and lift my back, and then I allow him out of my seat, make myself a little lighter. That's also important. I think that you have a dynamic seat, that you're not static and always in the same place, but you accompany the movement of the back, and then maybe accentuate the downward movement, the upward movement, the swing of the rib cage to the outside or whatever, so then you make the movement bigger in a sense by sometimes enhancing this direction, that direction, and nothing locks up as a result, you know.
Yes, and I want to interrupt you because I think this is an important point. I am often contacted by people through email or whatever, and their horse has had perhaps a traumatic kind of stifle situation or injury somewhere in the hind end. You know, a lot of the stuff happens in the middle of the night when the horse is in the pasture and all they find is a lame horse in the morning. They will do the vet prescribed period of rehab, and then they will commonly be looking for like, well, what's the next step? And many times people are very afraid to get, not like psychologically afraid to ride their horse, like timid. They are worried that they can only work the horse on the ground. And there's huge value in groundwork, enormous value in groundwork. But what you're describing, what I try to urge these people to understand is you're a great tool as a rider. You can help the horse. You are a therapy exercise if you think it's that way. Like, don't think of riding as being like, now I'm on the horse, I'm a big burden up here, or that I'm only sitting in my dressage seat. Like, your seat is dynamic. Sometimes I don't even want your butt in the saddle if that's what your horse needs. Sometimes you're only going to walk, but there's plenty that you can do in the walk. And in fact, my book has 3 walk routines just to give people an idea of how to spend 25 or 30 minutes in a walk. But so I'm glad you brought that up, Thomas, because sometimes I have to hold people's hands metaphorically quite a bit to get back on their horse and help them understand, like, hey, you're still rehabbing the horse from its back, because that's okay.
Yeah,
Yeah,
such a good point.
Yeah, you can do certain things in the saddle that you could not do on the ground, right? And you can use your body mass to, you know, help the horse develop more strength too. You know, there's a weightlifting aspect to riding for the horse, right? Lifting the rider's weight and supporting its own weight. And of course, then there is the yoga aspect, and there is the, in a way, a Feldenkrais aspect too for the horse too, you know, awareness through motion and that sort of thing, you know. So if you can combine all that, then you have a pretty big tool set, you know, with which you can help the horse.
Yeah.
And,
I
really also want to get back to what you were saying about not getting too obsessive, compulsive about the stifle, or whatever body part is affected, right? It could be any other body part too. And then people maybe think, oh, I have to work this body part, I have to work this joint, I have to work this muscle. But you can't isolate it in a way. Everything works together. Everything occurs in a pattern, like, you know, in Feldenkrais, our Feldenkrais teacher always says that you have to look at the entire pattern, and you have to look at the habits, you know, that the horse or the person has, right? And explore that and go from there, you know, and try out alternatives maybe.
Yeah, and it comes back to balance, right? Comes back to trying to help the horse find balance, even when we know they might be a little bit uncomfortable in whatever area. Maybe they're moving a little funky or a little stiff. We have to try to help them find balance, not force it, but find these ways to help bring the body into balance. Because I believe horses like us enjoy being in balance. They feel secure. They feel right in their mind and their body. And then their nervous system would be willing to let go of pain signals. And so probably you both already know this, but maybe some of the listeners don't. When there has been an acute trauma or pain, and sometimes that can be like a session of riding in a very badly fitting saddle or really harsh aids, like that can be a form of sort of trauma and pain. The horse's back muscles can completely switch off. The deep back muscles, the stabilizing muscles, all the signals to those muscles can completely switch off over a period of about 4 days. And they don't automatically just switch back on after we've resolved the discomfort. So the more ways we can help put their body back into balance and need to find balance through these exercises, that's how we switch on those muscles and keep them activated. Because to circle back around, if we're laser focused on, oh, my vet said my horse's stifles are weak, I need to strengthen his stifles, and you probably do. But if, as a result of why his stifles are weak, if his back muscles, the deep stabilizers, have turned off and you're not getting any motor sensory info to those muscles, you're stuck. I mean, you're not really going to make much headway.
Yeah. We often talk about that, how an injury or pain triggers a protective posture, you know, in humans and in horses. And once the injury has healed, the protective posture stays, right? So then the horse can develop a whole new kind of imbalance or crookedness, or, you know, then you have to really re-educate the horse that he moves normal again, you know. So he has to learn to trust his body that it's not going to hurt anymore, you're healed. So now you have to get rid of some bad habits that he developed while he was injured, you know, or, you know, like we do too. And then, you know, that's why we have, you know, physiotherapy and, you know, after breaking a bone, things like that.
Yeah, it's a big job. Yeah, it's a big job.
We had a couple more questions over on YouTube or on Facebook, and then I wanted to break off this part of the live stream, but let me address those really quick. So Elaine Campbell asks, can it be the toe going into the ground in weight bearing rather than the full foot linked with toe drag? I'm not sure exactly.
I would imagine that what she's talking about is that the hind leg doesn't land flat, but stabbing the ground with the toe and then dragging and making a little, you know, line in the sand. That's kind of how I picture that. So is this
linked? Okay.
Is that linked to stifle issues?
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like poor mechanics. Whether or not it's caused by stifle, who knows? Could be tight hamstrings that aren't allowing the leg to swing forward. It could be a poorly balanced foot again. It could be restriction in the back that's not landed. So, but regardless, the way to fix it in my world is kind of the same way. You would tackle it the same way, which would be, I mean, assuming it's not foot balance, you want to start there. But then you would use similar exercises to wake up the horse's body, get that situation to resolve.
Yes.
Yeah, you keep mentioning balance. And I wanted to just, you know, interject earlier. In the 19th century, basically all the classical authors were saying that balance and suppleness are the cornerstones of dressage. Right? Before there was a training scale, it was always balance and suppleness. And yeah, in my practical experience, I always come back to that too. That's all it is. You need to get the horse balanced and you to make the horse supple, you know, remove muscle blockages, and then you're good to go. That most of the problems go away, right?
Yeah, that's how it should be. Yeah. Yeah.
But it's a lifelong process.
It is lifelong, but I'm glad you make that point, because I don't know if you hear this from students, but sometimes I'll hear this refrain that students think like arena work, their horse doesn't like it, or they use these words around arena work that it's like arduous and serious and stern. And I think horses can enjoy their work.
Absolutely.
It is what makes them comfortable and it brings them into balance. And I don't think of arena work being drudgery. And so I'm glad you brought that up. It's like balance and suppleness. What's not to love? You know, I think they love it. I see it.
Exactly. I mean, what I see sometimes in you know, practice is that maybe horses initially think, man, this is hard. This is much harder than what I'm used to. But then once they've made the change in posture, they're more balanced. It's like, oh, this feels good. I'm more comfortable. You know, pain is going away. And then once they discover that you're not torturing them with what you're doing, but you're trying to help them, then their mindset changes and they're much more willing to work with you because they realize it feels good, even though it initially may require more effort or it may feel more strenuous. But once I have found a better balance, I feel good in my body. I feel better than I did before.
You feel better in your body and you feel better mentally too.
Yeah, exactly.
And the horses are the same as us in that regard.
Exactly.
Yeah. Sure.
That they become more cooperative as they become more balanced, I find. And yeah, they find it interesting if you have a conversation with them around balance, straightness, suppleness, and these things. It's, you know, it's not boring. It's not just endless circles in the same posture.
Right. No. Yeah.
And this question was kind of covered before.
Yeah, right? Shondell had asked if shoeing can play a role in correcting the problems, but you addressed that earlier.
I think we covered that,
Yeah, I think we did. So what, Thomas?
Maybe one more. Jackie Davis.
Oh, no, we will. We'll get to these, but this is the part of the live stream where we are going to break our ties with YouTube and Facebook, and we're going to just continue with our members only Q&A for Ritterize. before we do that, Jec, I wanted to give you the opportunity to tell our viewers where they can find more of you, where they can find out more about you, and anything else you want to tell them.
Oh.
What are you about to do? Any projects you're about to do, or you just released a book? I'm sure you're working on other things too, if you're anything like us. Anything you'd like to tell people about and where they can get in on that.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you. Thanks for having me on. I assume I'm just supposed to stay here throughout our transition here.
Yes,
Yes,
don't leave. We're going to continue, but we're going to stop the live stream for public, for the YouTube public. Yeah.
So for anybody here who I'm saying goodbye to at this point, my website is jecballou.com. It's JECBALLOU.com. And all my books are on there. I've written 4 books for horse exercises, and I have some online courses, mostly conditioning based, conditioning for the horse. I also do have a rider fitness course on there as well. So it's all on there. And I'm on kind of a personal mission. You asked what I'm working on. Right now, I'm not writing another book, but subject to change. I'm enjoying riding my own horses, teaching. I live in California, and I'm on a mission to really foster collaboration between like-minded trainers. So I love opportunities like this. I feel like for too long in our industry, there's been like these siloed trainers that might be excellent, but I just think there's enough business to go around, and we don't need to be threatened by each other. And I enjoy the chance to say, hey, I think Dr. Ritter's awesome. Like, I like chatting. Like, I enjoy that. And I'm trying to foster this in the industry. So, encourage your own trainers at home to be of similar mind, if that's appropriate. So that's my current project.
That's great. Yeah, I like that. That's really good.
Good.
Yeah.
So everybody who is watching on YouTube and Facebook, thank you. And we're going to say goodbye now.
We'll continue on Zoom.